Donnamarie is the curator and archivist at Sylvester Manor Educational Farm in Shelter Island, New York. And she spent over 30 years working in the editorial photography field as a photo editor for publications including People magazine and Essence, and as a photo librarian and editor at the Gamma Liaison photo agency. She curated a highly acclaimed historic tintype photography exhibition in 2015 at the Eastville Community Historical Society in Sag Harbor. And we're so thrilled that she's able to be here and join us today. So please join me in welcoming Donnamarie Barnes.
Thank you so much. Good morning. Good morning. Let's get this together. It's so nice to be here, and it's so nice to be in person telling stories again, and also online. So good morning to everybody at home. This is my first visit to Nantucket, although I've often heard about it. I live on another island, and I work on still a different island. I live in Sag Harbor, on the east end of Long Island in New York, in the Hamptons. Excuse me. Sag Harbor also shares a whaling town history, and it's one in which every child growing up there learns from an early age. Whaling and its symbols and history are all around us, branded onto everything that represents our villages and towns, from the signposts, logos, caps, T-shirts, coffee mugs. Whales are everywhere. I live in the community of Nineveh Beach. Does that come up? Yep. Which is part of the Sands community. Sands stands for Azure Rest, Sag Harbor Hills, and Nineveh settlements. It's a community that was developed after World War II, with African-American families buying beachfront property and building second homes. The families that came to spend their summers in Sag Harbor were professional people: doctors, lawyers, teachers, business people, and artists. They brought their families and friends, and through the decades, from the 1950s, it became a wonderful place to grow up, with friendships that lasted forever, for all of your lives. That's me in the picture. My parents were part of that first wave of homeowners, and I've spent my life in Sag Harbor, spending every summer of my childhood and now living there as a full-time resident. It is the home of my heart and the place of my soul, the place where my art as a photographer developed, and in recent years, the place where I found my life's work. As children growing up, we were not only steeped in the history of whaling, and specifically black whalers, but we were also told about an adjacent community that had been founded by free African Americans and Native Americans, the community of Eastville, which is adjacent to the Sands community and east of the Sag Harbor village. There was an old, overgrown, scary cemetery where we were told the old black people had been buried, but their names and specific stories about them were unknown or untold. In 2014, after many, many years of being a photo editor at People magazine, the magazine business was changing, the world of photojournalism was changing. I had been there too long, I just couldn't do another Oscars coverage. Not to mention the paparazzi, but that's a whole other story. And so I left the magazine, and I returned to Sag Harbor to figure out what's next. And visiting a friend at the Eastville Community Historical Society, she asked if I'd like to see their collections of tintypes. I've always been a student of the history of photography and knew that tintypes were a photographic technique used in the 19th century, and so I was really intrigued. I'd never heard that there was such a collection at Eastville. And from a closet on a hot, humid day, she pulled out an old box that had 2 old family photo albums and several small objects tightly wrapped in almost like cotton wool. And unwrapping them, let's go a little further here. Unwrapping them, I discovered literally what I felt was magic. Oops. My heart literally, it was pounding in my chest. I felt like I needed a cigarette and a glass of whiskey to deal with what was happening and what I was seeing. Here were the residents of Eastville, photographed in their best, taken in the late 1800s. These images, these portraits of men, women, and families who lived in their own homes in the Eastville section of Sag Harbor immediately called to me and said, "This is what's next. Tell our stories." The images were not labeled or identified, but seemed to have been taken by the same photographer. In addition to the tintypes, there were carte de visite photographs on cardboard backing that listed the name of the photographer as William G. Howard, who had lived in the neighborhood adjacent to Eastville and had a studio in the village of Sag Harbor from 1880 through 1910. So that was the time frame that we needed to work in, to do the research, to try to uncover who the individuals were in the photographs, and to build their stories, and to learn about their lives and their connection to this community. What was really very interesting was that a tintype is a singular image. It's almost like a Polaroid would have been. It's a small image that can be hand-carried on a small tin, what was then tin plate. What was really interesting about this collection was in these two family photo albums that had come from two separate families' homes, as well as the loose tintypes and photographs, was that they were a collection of the community. This was not just a photo album of the particular family, but of all of their neighbors. And this was a community of African Americans, Native Americans, and European immigrants. And this collection reflected the entirety of that community. So that made it even more extraordinary. So not only were these individuals going to be photographed, but they were sharing their images with each other to be held for remembrance in their family archive. Over the next year, the executive director of the Eastville Community Historical Society, Dr. Georgette Greer-Key, and I worked to uncover who had lived in Eastville, and with funding through the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, we researched and curated the exhibition of tintypes of the Eastville residents that was entitled Collective Identity, which opened in 2015. It was the first time these images had been seen by the public. Because I have a lot of photographer friends, I had each of the images rephotographed and retouched by the retoucher from People magazine, who also lived in the Hamptons. And so we blew them up, put them around the house, and it was a magnificent undertaking. In addition to the work that I began at Eastville, I was volunteering at another historical site on nearby Shelter Island called Sylvester Manor, whose history I had come to learn about in a book by a woman named Mac Griswold entitled The Manor, 3 Centuries at a Slave Plantation on Long Island. Now, at the time, a slave plantation on Long Island was a completely foreign concept to me and to everybody I knew. Slavery in the Hamptons, that's not something that we were ever taught in any level of our education. Slavery in the North was not something that is generally in the curriculum. We think of slavery, if you're from the North, you think of slavery as something that happened down south, not in your town or your village. Shelter Island is the ancestral home of the Manhasset people, who had lived there for a millennium. In 1651, the Connecticut Englishmen who owned the island of Shelter Island sold it to 4 partners who owned sugarcane plantations on the island of Barbados. They bought the 8,000-acre island for 1,600 pounds of good Muscovado sugar. We like to say it was the greatest real estate deal in the Hamptons has ever known. You cannot buy properties on Shelter Island for sugar any longer. The intention was to create a provisioning plantation, meaning the plantations that they owned in Barbados were growing sugarcane. It was worked by transported enslaved African people, and sugar had been introduced to Europe for the first time, making it the greatest cash crop in the world. So they were making literally money hand over fist. Every available acre of land on Barbados owned by the planters was used to grow sugarcane. Therefore, they were not growing food, and the enslaved workers were starving to death, literally, and dying from starvation. So the idea for these four partners was to buy a separate location to serve as a provisioning place to import what they needed, foodstuffs, livestock, raw materials. It was also during the English Civil War. The partners were parliamentarians, and so they felt that if they had an alternate location in case the Royalists won and they needed to vacate Barbados quickly, they would have some place to go. And an island seemed like the perfect solution. Just buy an island. Nathaniel Sylvester was the youngest of the partners, and he was tasked with developing the settlement on Shelter Island. With him, he brought enslaved Africans and indentured servants to work the land and to build a house and an operation. He also brought with him a young English wife who, when I say young, she was 16 years old. She was a child almost herself, who came with 3 enslaved people of her own. Eventually buying out the other partners, Nathaniel became the sole owner of the island and established a family that retained ownership of dwindling acres of land for 11 generations. In 2014, the 11th generation heir made the decision to give the property away, creating the not-for-profit organization Sylvester Manor Educational Farm. Today, we're simply called Sylvester Manor, and the property contains 246 acres of land, a 1737 manor house, an 1810 windmill, barn structures, and a working organic farm. Our mission is to preserve, cultivate, and share historic Sylvester Manor, telling the stories of all the people who lived, worked, and died there, and we envision a farm, a community, and a world where people celebrate art and inventiveness in the everyday with a spirit of fairness and joy. In my role as curator and archivist, and now as the Director of History and Heritage, I have sought to research and recover the names and identities of the enslaved and people of color who along with the descendants of the Sylvester family, contributed to the history of the place and to the East End of Long Island. Excuse me. In his 1680 last will and testament, Nathaniel Sylvester listed 24 enslaved men, women, and children divided into family groups. We consider these 24 individuals to be among the founders of Shelter Island and the East End. An unknown number of them are buried on the property in unmarked graves in what we call the Afro-Indigenous burial ground. Among those listed in the will were a couple who we know were African-born from Nigeria, Tamaro and his wife, Oyo. Not a good time to get my throat scratchy. They were the parents of 4 children born at Sylvester Manor, the eldest of whom was called Obium. Through documentation and reading letters and papers, we've uncovered that Obium was given to Nathaniel's daughter Patience and her husband James Lloyd. He was sent to live in Boston and eventually to Lloyd's Manor in Queens Village on the north shore of Long Island. There he was taught to read and write, and he married another enslaved woman named Rose. Their eldest son was called Jupiter Hammond. Jupiter was also educated by the Lloyds, who were highly religious, and he became a strong Christian. He also became the first published African-American poet. Through the years, we have dug deeper into our research, as well as conducting various archaeological digs done by the University of Massachusetts at Boston, and we have uncovered the stories of the people of Sylvester Manor that we present to the public through house tours, walking history tours, exhibitions, on our website, and through social media posts, as well as in talks and lectures, both online and in person. The history of the place is one that is felt throughout the property, and visitors often remark that they feel something as they enter the gates and come down the drive or walk through the trails, even before they hear any of the story. For me, as a photographer, I find inspiration, clarity, and understanding as I walk and photograph on the property. The sense of memory, history, trauma, and love can be felt in the sound of the trees and the smell of the water in the woods. The collections of Sylvester Manor, the books, paintings, photographs, decorative arts, and mostly among the thousands of papers, letters, and documents, tell a story of a family and of those who lived there over the centuries. This year, with funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, we have broadened and deepened our research to include other regional archives and libraries and historical societies in order to tell a more complete story of the people of color, of the manor, and of the surrounding area. Ongoing, non-invasive archaeological work at the Afro-Indigenous Burial Ground by the University of Massachusetts at Boston, and again, and in partnership with the Shinnecock Nation's Grave Protections Warrior Society, we have undertaken to understand the site and its perimeters better, to find out just how big it is, to explore its origins as an ancestral site, and to work to identify the individuals buried there, to provide them with biographies and, as it were, obituaries. This work has allowed us to learn and to tell the stories from slavery to freedom of individuals, their families, and generational descendants from the 18th and 19th centuries. For many years, when attempting to learn these names and stories, we were told by historical sites and societies, as well as archives, that this information was just not there, or couldn't be found in the records, or known, or just simply those boxes have never been looked at. But we have learned by reading census records, last wills and testaments, deeds, and letters that the information has always been there. It's been there in plain sight, waiting to be read and spoken of. This long history, it feels sometimes, was remembered to be forgotten and forgotten to be remembered. In 2017, the editor-in-chief of the East Hampton Star newspaper, David Rattray, and I established a project called the Plainside Project, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to finding, naming, and counting the enslaved and free people of color of the East End of Long Island. Starting with a handful of names, our lists now contain close to 1,000 names, and our research has extended from the village of and town of East Hampton on the South Fork to Southold on the North Fork of Long Island. With a partnership this year with the Sag Harbor Cinema Movie Theater, we have begun a project to research the history of Sag Harbor and its links to slavery in the years before whaling began. From the first founding of every town and village on the East End, slavery was present and a ubiquitous institution, an economic driver. The area has always been made up of diverse communities of three cultures: indigenous native clans of the Manhasset, Shinnecock, Nantucket, and Quechua people, European settlers, and the enslaved and free people of color of African descent brought to the area against their will. Excuse me. This spring, working with the Teen Arts Council from the Guildhall Museum in East Hampton, we've created a series of memorial bronze bricks that are hand-engraved with the names of enslaved people, their enslaver, and any other information we have about them, such as the date of their death or their manumission. The bricks will be installed on the sidewalks of East Hampton in front of the places where the individuals lived. The first two markers were placed last weekend in front of the East Hampton Library and at the Mulford Farm, both on Main Street. The idea was inspired by the Stumbling Stones in Germany and the Witness Stone Project in Connecticut. Combining the work of the Plainside Project, the Eastville Community Historical Society, and Sylvester Manor, we have discovered the extension of founding European families throughout the region and the enslaved people they owned, sold, and bequeathed between them. We have also been able to follow the path of the enslaved following the Revolution, when manumissions became prevalent either due to financial difficulties after the war or through changing moral values. Free people continue to work and live at Sylvester Manor after emancipation and become members of the local church. They bought property on the island, and their children often moved to neighboring towns and villages, such as to Eastville. On Shelter Island, the community of free people continued to be buried in unmarked graves at the burial site at Sylvester Manor, not in the church cemeteries on the island, despite becoming members of the church. When the whaling industry was at its height in Sag Harbor, formerly enslaved men went to sea, and for the first time in many instances were valued according to their skills. When they returned from sea, they came home with stronger senses of self and began to buy property and build homes in the Eastville community, starting families. An early founder of Eastville was a man named David Hempstead. His name was well known to us growing up in Sands. There was a street named after him, and he was the founder of the St. David's AME Zion Church and Cemetery, established for the Eastville community in 1840. But I knew very little about his beginnings until I came to Sylvester Manor, and actually very little until just recently. The research that we've been able to conduct this year with the funding from the Mellon Foundation has allowed us to dive deeper, go down multiple rabbit holes, and come up with jewels. As part of our extensive research, we put together an incredible story of this African-American family. The David Hempstead of Eastville was actually David Hempstead Jr., and his father, David Hempstead Sr., was a major figure in Sylvester Manor history, a figure whose story has never been told before, including in the Mac Griswold book or in the histories of any of the history of Shelter Island. He was born into slavery in 1789 in the household of Thomas Hempstead of Southold. He was manumitted in Thomas Hempstead will of 1805, and he had been taught to read and write. And upon being manumitted, he took Hempstead as his last name. He moved to Shelter Island to live and work and married a free woman named Athena, and they began a family. David Hempstead worked at Sylvester Manor and other properties on the island, and in 1825, he became the farm manager of the manor and worked for Esther Sarah Deering, the widow of Sylvester Deering, a Sylvester descendant and owner of the manor property at the time. Together, they managed the estate through the financial hardships the family endured following the Revolution. His name appears on nearly every page of Esther Sarah's account books as being an integral part of everyday life at the manor. What's interesting to note about his name being listed in this account book is that Esther Sarah, as the widow of the property and trying gallantly to hold it together, lists David Hempstead and the other free people of color working at the manor. The last enslaved person at Sylvester Manor was manumitted in 1820. She lists them by their first name only. And various other accounts that we go through, African American people are listed by their name, but with a qualifier. So in another account book, David Hempstead is listed as David, colored man. But in Esther Serra's book, he is always just David Hempstead or David's sons or whoever else was living there at the time, Violet, Anthony. She treats them as individuals who with her are fighting to keep this property going as their home. Over time, Hempstead was able to save enough money to buy a 93-acre farm of prime land on Shelter Island. He and his family were members in good standing of the Shelter Island Presbyterian Church, although he was cited for intoxication of drinking beer at the end of a day with another farmer. They were very strict about those kind of rules and mentioned all of that. When he died in November of 1843, he was returning to the island from Sag Harbor, and he fell overboard on the ferry. Several newspaper accounts of his death record him and remember him as a long-standing Shelter Island resident and a respected colored man. However, he is buried in an unmarked grave at the burial ground at Sylvester Manor. This year, in recognition of David Hempstead's contributions to Sylvester Manor and Shelter Island, we are naming a newly cleared farm field in his honor as Hempstead Field. And I'm telling this story to you for the first time in public. His story will be the focus of our house tours and walking tours this season for the first time. And these stories strengthen our history, not only of Sylvester Manor, but also of Eastville, where his descendants lived and made such a vast contribution, and to the history of the entire area of the East End of Long Island. This is a New York story, this is an American story, this is American history, not just the story of a black man who lived on a small island on the East End of Long Island. At present, we don't have a recognized descendant community on the East End of the descendants of the enslaved and free people of color. Ooh, I don't know what I did. Okay, let's try that. But we feel that by telling these stories, doing more and more research to uncover their identities and to place them into our history, eventually we hope that someone will come forward to say, I think that's my relative. I think I'm related to them. The Sands Historic District of Sag Harbor, where I live, was listed on the National and State Registers of Historic Places in 2019, but it continues to be threatened by the fast-paced redevelopment driven by skyrocketing property values on Long Island's East End and in the Hamptons. Every year, original properties are demolished, as they are on Martha's Vineyard, and lots are merged to make way for construction of much bigger and more exclusive luxury real estate. We are striving to retain our sense of community and family and hold our history as valuable legacy as part of the greater Sag Harbor Village that we hope to be passed on to future generations. I live in Sag Harbor, and the history of Sands and its cultural significance is of vast importance to me. Through my work as a historical storyteller and a photographer, my homeland and connecting our present histories to the stories of the past has been the calling that I am honored to answer. Thank you so much for inviting me today and for listening to my stories.
Thank you so much, Donnamarie. That was really fantastic.
Thank you.
Love to hear about it. So do we have any questions here in the room? And I should note for the people listening online, you do have to sort of speak directly into the mic for them to be able to hear. So just have everybody try and speak clearly and loudly for those folks online. Anybody?
Yes.
Yeah, how did you find your census data and the wills and stuff? Just curious about
great
the
question.
archives and such.
About the methodology. Well, there are many ways that we start. For one, Sylvester Manor, the family that descended through 11 generations, I like to say that they were historical hoarders. They never threw away a piece of paper. If you wrote them a letter, they kept it in the envelope. So the house is filled with documentation and history. 10,000 documents were donated to the New York University's Fales Library in 2014. And those documents have been digitized and are online to be accessed, which is a wonderful device. Ancestry.com is a great place to start for census records. Historical Society archives, going through papers. Again, last wills and testaments are listed on Ancestry.com. I'll tell you a story. There was someone that we were researching, another property owner on Shelter Island who was, we were looking for specific enslaved people on their property. And so we read this will, and the man's name I can't remember at the moment, but we found his will from an archive that's housed at the New York Historical Society, and it was transcribed in about 1925. And the typed version of the last will and testament listed that the man in question had bequeathed, "To my wife and to my son, I leave my elder enslaved man and woman." Or actually, they didn't say enslaved, that's the language we use now. My elder slave Negro and my elder slave Negro woman, without a name. I looked up the same will on Ancestry.com, and there was the original document that's been digitized and you can read. And in the original version of the will, he had specified what their names were. Which makes you wonder, like, why in the transcription were those two items left out? Why did they become suddenly anonymous people when the man who was bequeathing them himself had taken the time to actually name them? So reading original documents as much as possible helps with our work. Yes, you have to get used to the handwriting, but after a while, you can almost tell who's writing what documents. Manumission papers are sometimes listed or held in the archives of historical societies as well. As well as this year, because we've had the funds to be able to dedicate ourselves to this specific research, one of the ways that we found a vast amount of documentation and information that revealed not only the names of enslaved and free people of color who lived at Sylvester Manor, but the relationships that they held with the property owners, with the family members themselves. And we found that information by reading the letters of extended family members, writing back to either their mothers or their aunts or the news that the residents of Sylvester Manor were sending out to the extended family. That included mentions of formerly enslaved people who were still living there. So, in other words, a letter from Mary Catherine Lamadou to her nephew would say, "I'm sorry to tell you that Achilles, who was a young boy who worked in the kitchen, is gravely ill and we're terribly worried about him." And several letters then went back and forth about the issue of Achilles being ill. The family doctor was on call. Several family members made specific trips back to Shelter Island to come and visit him to make sure that things were all right. And when he eventually dies, the family is heartbroken. And they convey all this information in the letters that they write to each other. And so we would never have known this story just by going by a listing of a name on a census record or in a last will and testament. These personal letters have really revealed personal and emotional attachments, which has enriched all of the stories that we tell.
This is a fact I can't remember. When was slavery made illegal in New York State?
Yes.
And then what happened to these people living on this farm or plantation?
Right. Okay. That's a great question. And one we talk about all the time when we give talks or tours. Slavery was abolished in New York in 1827. Now, how many of you were taught that in school? One. Yes. Yeah. Yes, it's not something that, growing up in New York, we were ever made aware of. As I said, the last person, enslaved person at Sylvester Manor was manumitted in 1820. And so when New York's eventual emancipation in 1827, there were no more enslaved people living there. What happened to the free people after they were given their freedom? In one case, there was a woman named Matilda, who we can trace from childhood now through her death on Shelter Island. She had been enslaved in Southold and was then sold to another family, the Havens, the Deering family of Sylvester Manor. During the Revolution, when the family went into exile, they left Matilda behind to care for the property, which was occupied by the British. And when they returned 7 years later to find that the property had been decimated by the occupation and they were in dire economic straits, she was manumitted in 1797, and we have her manumission papers, which we found in the East Hampton Library archives. Upon being granted her freedom, she borrowed $75 from the two brothers who had enslaved her, who had inherited her from their father. She borrowed $75 to build a house on a piece of land that is owned by the owners of Sylvester Manor that she has to pay rent on. So despite the fact that she is now a free woman, and she is listed in the 1800 census as a free woman of color and head of her household, which is a wonderful historical fact. But in fact, in her freedom, she was indebted to the very same men who had enslaved her and were also in economic straits. So by freeing her, they actually made out good on the deal. Yes.
One thing that's interesting on the Nantucket history, I find very interesting, is how early slavery was abolished here. And that was, I think, 1773.
Yeah.
But it was a bigger issue in that they refused to integrate schooling, and that became sort of historic.
At the time?
Following that, even though they abolished the slavery, they refused to integrate.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.